Welcome everybody to our third webinar. It's great to see so many people on the call. For any of you that are newcomers to our webinar series, I'm Jerry Friedman, grandma, mom, and co-chair of ECA, and that is in order of importance, I think. We've got two great presentations tonight, so hopefully you will relax and enjoy. The webinar tonight is going to be in two parts, like it was last webinar. The first part, you're going to be hearing from Nathaniel Stinnett, who I'll tell you a little bit more about in a couple of minutes. And then following his presentation, we'll have a short break and hear from ECA leaders who will introduce and launch our critical campaign leading up to the midterm elections. The campaign is called the Candidates Pledge Climate Action, and we're very excited to launch this, hoping to really make some big impact in the midterm elections. So we'll also have time for Q&A. And right now, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Laurel Bollinger, who will just let you know how to navigate around the screen, how to chat, and how to ask some questions. So Laurel.
Thank you, Jerry. All right, so yeah, I'm just gonna show you two things. One is how to ask questions throughout both of the presentations today. We invite you to ask questions throughout, and then we'll have, like Jerry said, a Q&A at the end. So if you bring your mouse, scroll your mouse down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a black bar pop up. And in the middle towards the right, you'll see a, it says Q&A. And it has like a little box with maybe a circle in the middle of it. If you click on that, your Q&A box will pop up. And in the bottom, it'll say, please input your question. You type your question there, and then you press send. So if we feel like it's a question we can just quickly answer, we will answer it with by typing, which probably won't be most of the questions. And you'll see that answer pop up below the question you asked. You will also see all the other questions that are asked by participants. And if you click the tab kind of to the right on your Q&A box that pops up, you'll see the questions that you have asked only. So if you want to make sure maybe your question had been answered with someone typing it, you can see it there. And then if you do have any technical issues, we ask that you let us know via chat. So if you, down again at the bottom of your screen towards the left of middle, there's the chat function. Go ahead and that'll pop up in a pop-up box as well, or to the right of your screen. You'll type your message where it says type message here at the bottom, and then you're going to click enter or return on your keyboard, and that will send the message off. There is no send button for the chat. It's a little confusing. For the question and answer, there's a send button. For the chat, you just press enter or return. And we will try and answer your questions or deal with your technical difficulty with that. So yeah, in the chat section, that's for technical questions. In the Q&A, that's for questions for Nathan or Jen, Jerry, and Margo at the end. All right, that's all for me.
Thank you, Laurel. I would like now to introduce to you Nathaniel Stinnett. Nathaniel's the founder and executive director of the Environmentalists Vote project, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that uses big data and behavioral science to identify non-voting environmentalists and then get them to vote. He's been dubbed the voting guru by Grist magazine and was named one of America's 50 environmental visionaries. He's a frequent expert speaker on cutting-edge campaign techniques at top universities and campaign management trainings. He's had a variety of senior leadership and campaign manager positions across the US and in the Senate, congressional, state, and mayoral campaigns, and sits on the board of advisors for MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. Formerly, he was an attorney at the international law firm DLA Piper LLP, lives in Boston with his wife and two daughters. We are very, very honored to have Nathaniel speak with us tonight. And I can remind you that ECA has partnered with his project, the Environmental Photo Project, And we have our partnership, and ours is the Elders Vote Climate, which ties into his Environmental Voter Project. You can take that pledge on our website or on the Environmental Voter Project website and make your voice heard. So before Nathaniel begins, we're going to have a little bit of fun, and I'm going to ask a question which will pop up on your screen. And that question is, what percentage of registered voters who identify as environmentalists actually voted in the last midterm elections in 2014? What you need to do now is just click on what percentage you believe is of registered voters fit that criteria, and then you will find out the answer to that as Nathaniel rolls through his presentation. So right now, I would like to turn it over to Nathaniel, and also to tell you at the end of his presentation, we'll have some Q&A, so put your questions in the chat box. So please answer the polling question rather, and Nathaniel, it's over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Jen. Both of you have just been so helpful in getting this whole webinar up and running. And I also just want to very quickly thank Grady McGonigal in Massachusetts. I don't know if Grady's on the webinar, but over a year ago, he first reached out to me and other people at the Environmental Voter Project and introduced me to the work that all of you are doing at Elders Climate Action. And it's just been wonderful getting to know all of you through Grady, and I'm very grateful that he reached out to us. So I'm going to very briefly talk about our work at the Environmental Voter Project. And as Jerry mentioned, it's going to be about a 25-30-minute webinar, and we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A towards the end. So what I'm not going to do, and I hope you'll forgive me, is drill down in real detail about some of the tools we use. I could go on for a very, very long time about the predictive modeling we use to identify voters, or the behavioral science we use to change their habits. I'm only going to touch on that a little bit because I do want to respect your time, and I really want to figure out what you care most about during the Q&A. So please just bear with me if there's something that you think I am breezing over too quickly. Understand that it's probably by design, and I just want you to ask questions about it, and I want to see what you care most about. So,
oh, Nathaniel, if I could interrupt,
yeah.
You may want to make it, we can't see it in presentation mode at the moment.
Ah, thank you very,
Yes.
very much. Let me see if I can fix this. I'm glad you told me. Oh, great. Thank you for letting me know about that. All right. So the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that simply finds environmentalists who aren't voting and then tries to turn them into more consistent voters. So what we do not do is endorse candidates. What we do not do is lobby to try to promote certain policies. And what we do not do is even try to persuade people to care more about climate and the environment. And it's not because those three things I just mentioned aren't important. They're very important. But we focus on finding environmentalists who aren't voting and turning them into better voters for, I think, a very good reason that I'll be getting to shortly. First, I want to talk about a problem that we have in the environmental movement. And that is this. Why can't we consistently enact progressive environmental policy? Well, I'm not going to pretend that there's only one answer to this question. There are a bunch of answers to this question. But one really, really big reason is this. When you ask voters to prioritize the issues they care about most, whether you're talking about a city council election or president of the United States or anything in between, when you ask them to prioritize the issues they care about most, climate change and other environmental issues are almost always towards the bottom of that list. Almost always towards the bottom of that list. This poll that I have up here, as you'll see, it's from the 2016 presidential election. And we asked registered voters who were likely to vote what their number 1 priority was and their number 2 priority. And you'll see only 2%, only 1 out of every 50 listed it as their top priority, and then another 2% listed it as their second priority. And I can guarantee you there is nothing cherry-picked about this poll. You poll likely voters in a city council race in Boston or governor of Idaho or any election, and climate and the environment are going to be way down voters' list of priorities. And this has a huge impact on how policy is made. Because not only will this change the type of people who get elected, but if voters don't care about something, why on earth would we expect politicians to? You all know how often politicians poll. As we're all sitting here on this webinar, there are probably 100 polls in the field asking voters what issues they care about and what messages appeal to them. And if poll after poll after poll comes back looking like this, why on earth would any politician, liberal or conservative, spend their time and energy talking about climate and the environment? This is a big problem. My guess is that all of you, like I, were really, really disappointed and frustrated that climate change didn't come up once in any of the 3 presidential debates. This is why. You were all also probably frustrated that Donald Trump didn't mention climate change once in the State of the Union. But guess what? Joe Kennedy, who gave the Democratic response to the State of the Union, also didn't talk about climate change. And it's not because Joe Kennedy and Donald Trump are the same on this issue. Of course they're not. But no matter who you are, Democrat or Republican, you are not going to lead on climate change when it is way, way, way down the list of voter priorities. Politics, despite the very corrupting influence of money, is still a pretty efficient marketplace. If the marketplace doesn't want something, no one's going to supply it. And right now, voters aren't begging for climate leadership. So why on earth would any politician supply it? So this is a poll that frustrated me throughout my career in politics that Jerry mentioned. But it also led to me starting the Environmental Voter Project, because there's something really, really interesting hidden beneath the numbers in this poll. Campaigns only target likely voters. That's so important for you to realize. And don't worry, I realize I had a little non sequitur there. I'm going to get to the numbers beneath that poll. Don't worry, I'm going to get to that on the next slide. But first, I just want to say, it's really important to understand that campaigns only target likely voters. So when you think about that poll, those are the only people who campaigns care about. And that means they're only going to poll likely voters. And so, as I said before, this means that every politician knows by looking at polls like that, that voters don't prioritize climate and the environment. But guess what? You look a little deeper under polls like that, and you realize something extraordinary. The reason so few voters prioritize climate change is not because too few Americans do. Now, I'm going to say that again because it's a little confusing. The reason so few voters prioritize climate change is not because too few Americans do. There are actually tens of millions of Americans who deeply care about climate change and the environment. They care about it so much they list it as one of their top 2 priorities. So why aren't those people showing up in polls of likely voters? Because they're not voting. The Environmental Voter Project has done an enormous amount of research using public voter files, and we've realized that environmentalists are disproportionately awful voters. In fact, the last time we had a midterm election, so as everybody on this webinar knows, we're coming up on a big important midterm. The last time we had a midterm election, 15.78 million already registered voters who list climate or the environment as one of their top priorities stayed at home and never went to the polls. 15.78 million. And they're already registered. They just didn't bother going out the door on election day. Jerry or Jen, do you guys have the results of the poll?
Nathaniel, can you see that on your screen?
I can't. Can you?
Okay. I will read it to you.
Great.
8% of our members thought 10%.
Mm-hmm.
19% thought 20%. And 38% thought 30%. 27% thought 40%. And 8% thought 50%.
All right. Well, now for the big reveal. 21% of environmentalists who are already registered to vote showed up in the last midterm election. Only 21%. So for those 19% of you who guessed 20, you're the winners. And I'm not surprised that so many of you thought it was a higher number. I was shocked too. When I realized how few environmentalists were voting, it threw me for an enormous surprise. So much so that I ended up leaving my high-paying job and starting a nonprofit, which is pretty insane. But I realized that the environmental movement actually has an extraordinary opportunity here, because we spend so much time and energy trying to convince people to care more about climate change. And I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you this, but that is hard and it is expensive. And in this increasingly post-truth world we live in, I don't know how to convince anybody of anything. But if there are all of these people out there who are already convinced, who are already with us, they're already dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who don't just accept climate change, but view it as a high priority. If there are so many people like that out there who just aren't showing up on election day, well, that's a big opportunity. And what might seem frustrating at first, what at first might make you shake your heads and say, why the heck aren't these people voting, is actually a big, big opportunity for change. Because changing people's behavior is a hell of a lot easier than changing their minds. I'm not going to claim it's a walk in the park. Getting someone who isn't voting to start voting is not easy, but boy, is it easier than trying to turn a climate denier. And boy, is it easier than trying to get people who don't care that much about climate change to start caring about it. So this is the world we're living in as we're about 90 days from the next midterm election. Only 21% of us, of people who deeply care about climate change, showed up for the 2014 election. And to give you some context on that, overall turnout of registered voters in 2014 was 44%. So that means the average registered voter in the United States was twice as likely to vote as environmentalists were, 44% to 21%. The environmental movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem. And I think it's so important to understand that at this moment in time, when I know all of you are considering what your electoral engagement will be. So, I just want to provide a little bit more context, and then I'm going to get into the two things that the Environmental Voter Project does, which is identifying environmentalists who don't vote and then getting them to vote. But first, I just want to provide a little bit more context on this environmental voter turnout problem that I've mentioned to you. We have a nice round number in the United States, about 200 million registered voters right now. But as I'm sure all of you are aware, if not painfully aware, it isn't like all of them show up every time there's an election. So last time there was a midterm in 2014, we had about 83 million people turn out to vote. Of those 83 million people who actually voted, our research tells us that only 4.2 million of them, only 4.2 million, so about 5% of them, were what we would call at the Environmental Voter Project super environmentalists. These are people who don't just care about climate or the environment, but list climate change or the environment as one of their top 2 priorities. So only 4.2 million of them turned out to vote. Let's fast forward 2 years to the 2016 presidential election. About 136, 137 million people turned out to vote. Now, environmentalists did a little bit better during a presidential election, but to be honest, it was still pretty bad. About 10.1 million super environmentalists turned out to vote. So 10.1 out of about 137 million. So we made up about 7%, 7.5% of overall turnout. Not much. Not much. That is not a powerful voting bloc. That is not enough to make people stand up, take notice, and talk about climate change, which clearly we need to get people to start doing. Now, guess what? Here's the really, really interesting part of this. There's another 10 million already registered environmentalists who live up near the top of that chart there. These are already registered to vote environmentalists who don't even turn up for presidential elections. They're registered to vote, they just don't walk out the door. And so you'll see literally half of all registered to vote environmentalists in this country never vote, not even in presidential elections. So at the Environmental Voter Project, what we do in a visual description is we don't try to turn any of these blue squares green. There are a lot of great groups that already do that. Instead, all we're trying to do is identify those voters up there who deeply care about climate and the environment but aren't voting. Then we just try to change their behavior. We're just trying to push them into the electorate. And the reason we do that is some people would call it a cynical approach. I don't think it's that cynical. I think it's just arithmetic. Politicians go where the votes are. It's that simple. Politicians go where the votes are. If they don't go where the votes are, then they don't get to be politicians anymore. That's simply how elections work. And so we feel like no matter who we elect, they're not going to lead unless voters, not non-voters, voters care deeply about climate and the environment. And we think the most efficient way to make that happen is to find these people who are already with us but not voting and turn them into better voters. So that's what we do. That's what we do. Now, very, very quickly, how do we identify these people who are non-voting environmentalists? And then how do we turn them into better voters? The identification part, and this is going to be one of those things that I'm happy to go into more detail on during the Q&A session. What we do is we build what's called predictive models. The way that we do this is we will poll 15, sometimes 20,000 people per state. Enormous surveys. And all we're doing in these polls is asking people, hey, what's your number 1 most important political priority? And what's your number 2 most important political priority? And we get all of this data back, and then we start comparing it to the information that's on public voter files, which has every registered voter's age and street address and census tract and their gender. We have a pretty good idea of what their ethnicity is. We know what their party affiliation is. We have lots of information. And what we can do is we can start looking for patterns. We can say, oh, look, there are a whole bunch of middle-aged suburban men outside of Philadelphia and Atlanta who listed climate change as their number 1 priority. How interesting. Oh, and here's another group outside of Phoenix that had these indicators. And we look for all these hidden patterns and correlations. And we build a model off that state's voter file. We assign a score to every single person in that state voter file. telling us how likely they are to list climate and the environment as one of their top 2 priorities. Now, this is a very long and involved process, and I've skipped over a lot of the details. And as I said, I'm happy to get into it. But the long and short of it is, this is an enormously accurate process. This is how every presidential campaign identified voters, Trump and Clinton. This is how most of the sophisticated US Senate and gubernatorial campaigns are doing it right now. And it's enormously accurate. When we built this list of super environmentalists in each state where we're operating, our last step was to send the lists out to an outside polling company and say, hey, can you check our work? The worst score they ever got when polling all these people was that 89% of the respondents off the top of their heads listed climate and the environment as one of their top 2 priorities. That was the worst score we got. These are really, really precise lists built off voter files where we can identify who the super environmentalists are. And as many of you know, who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public information. And so when we identify these environmentalists and confirm that they're environmentalists by polling them again, we can also look at their voting histories. And in every single state that we're operating in, environmentalists have worse turnout rates than the average registered voter in that state. We've got a turnout problem. But the good news is, with these tools, with these data analytics tools, we're now able to individually identify these super environmentalists, cut out the ones who are already good voters, and simply focus on the ones who aren't voting. So then comes the second step, mobilization. I'm not going to talk about the third step, habit reinforcement. That's about what we do after each election and follow up with people. Again, I'm happy to go into detail on that in the Q&A if you're interested. But I want to drill down a little bit on mobilization. Once we've identified these non-voting environmentalists, how do we get them to vote? Well, the media that we use are door-to-door canvassing, phone calls, direct mail, digital ads, and text messages. But I think more important than that is the messaging that we use. I'll cut right to the punchline here because I think it's really interesting and will probably be interesting for all of you. The Environmental Voter Project never talks about the environment. And it's not because I don't like talking about climate change. It's not because our field staff doesn't like talking about climate change. It's because it doesn't work. And I want to be clear about what I mean by that. Talking about climate change is a great way to persuade someone to care more about climate change. So I'm not saying that Elders Climate Action shouldn't talk about climate change. But if all you're doing is trying to get someone's rear end out the door on election day, it turns out that talking to them about the issues that they care about actually doesn't motivate them to vote. It doesn't. Instead, what we've realized, and it's not just us, a lot of other behavioral scientists have realized this, the messaging that is most effective at getting a non-voter to start voting is to use peer pressure and social pressure. And what I mean by that is some of the examples you'll see in that little box that says messaging. We get people to promise to vote, just like you do. That's one of the ways in that we're partnering with Elders Climate Action, is we have people sign a pledge to vote and always prioritize climate and the environment. And the reason it's so important to get people to sign that pledge is not just so we can remind them of the election right before it happens. No, the power in that pledge is that all of us, unless you're a sociopath, all of us want to be known as honest promise keepers. And so if you get someone to promise to vote, and then right before the election, you remind them of that promise and you say, hey, Jerry, I just wanted to remind you on August 8th, you made a promise that you would vote in this election, and the election's on Tuesday, and we know it's important to you to be an honest promise keeper, so this is your opportunity to follow through on your promise. It has an enormous impact. Simply getting people to promise to vote and then reminding them of that and getting them to follow through on that promise can increase turnout 4, 5, even 6%. And if you don't think 5 or 6% sounds like a lot, well, you can talk to some of my friends on the Clinton campaign and they will tell you 5 or 6% is everything in this business, everything. Another tool that we use is just plain old peer pressure. It's like we're in second or third grade. We write letters to people and we say, hey, Jen, did you know last time there was an election, 93 of your neighbors on Main Street turned out to vote? Yeah, peer pressure still works. If people think that all of their neighbors are voting, they are dramatically more likely to vote themselves. Finally, we will often compare people's voting histories to other people on the street. And I want to be clear, we don't out anybody. We don't tell people's neighbors what Joe's voting history is, but we'll send you a letter and we'll say, hey, Jerry, I wanted to remind you that whether you vote or not is public information. And comparing your turnout history to people on your street, we realize that you're only in the 27th percentile of all the neighbors on your street. We essentially give them a grade. We don't tell that grade to any of their neighbors, but we tell it to Jerry. We tell it to the environmentalists we're trying to turn into better voters. That can increase turnout as much as 7%. Because just like we realize that everybody wants to be good, honest promise keepers, we've realized another societal norm that's still very strong in this country. Even people who don't vote want to be seen as good voters. And that's really important to understand because most people think, oh, if you don't vote, you've probably given up on the system. But no, that's not the case. Our research has shown that even people who never vote, when they understand that people's voting histories are public information and all of their neighbors and people like them in their age group are voting more often than they do, they change their habits in a pretty dramatic fashion. So that's what we do with the Environmental Voter Project. We simply identify environmentalists who aren't voting, and we use a lot of data analytics tools to do that, and I'm happy to go into more detail in the Q&A. And then, once we know we've found the right people, well, at that point, we would talk about chocolate chip cookies if it got these people to vote. But what's really interesting is the messaging that works best is not talking about climate. It's not talking about the environment. It's using peer pressure. It's using social pressure. And as I finish this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about that, because it's very important for all of you as leaders in your community to internalize these two facts that I've set out there. One, it's that a lot of your colleagues, a lot of people who care about climate and the environment, who are around you, are not going to vote. They're not. But the best tool you have to turn them into a voter is peer pressure. Now, I'm not saying revert to third grade and treat them like crap. But what I am saying is the more you can let all of your colleagues and neighbors know that you are a voter, the more you can let them know that one of the ways that you express yourself as a grandparent or as an elder or as someone who cares about climate change is by voting, well, that's going to have an enormous impact on them. Because people look to you for their behavioral cues, just like you look to other people for their behavioral cues. And that's an enormously powerful thing to understand over the next 90 days. The more you can be loud and proud about the fact that you are voting because you're an environmentalist, because you care about climate change, well, you can have an enormous impact just by letting people know that. So, in closing, you can go onto our website and see some of the results that we've had. We're having a pretty dramatic impact in the states where we operate. And we think that in the 6 states where we're working, and I'll show in more detail what those states are on the next slide, but very quickly, they're Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Massachusetts, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. In those 6 states, we think we can add anywhere from 67,000 to 108,000 brand new environmental voters to the electorate this fall, simply by using these peer pressure and social pressure messages. And again, if you don't think that's a big number, think back to November 2016, where the presidential election was decided by a mere 77,000 votes. These are really, really big numbers. As I mentioned, we're active in these 6 states that you see. In these 6 states alone, we've identified 2.4 million super environmentalists who are already registered to vote, yet their voting histories tell us that they are very unlikely to vote this fall. And so those are the people we're going after. If you're an environmentalist who's a good voter, we don't talk to you. There are a lot of great groups that already talk to you and try to persuade you to vote for the right person and all that. We don't touch you. We only go after the people who are very unlikely to vote. And what we're doing is we have volunteers around the country, whether you're in one of these 6 states or not, who are canvassing, calling, and texting these people every single day. We're contacting about 25,000, 30,000 voters each day now. And we have about 1,600 volunteers around the country doing that. Come October and November, we'll also have some non-volunteer outreach to these voters. We'll be sending them mail and digital advertisements. So in closing, I just want to say, please, please, please don't let your one takeaway from this presentation be, oh man, this guy Nathaniel Stinnett told us that environmentalists don't vote, and like, this is the end of the world. I can't believe our people don't care. I give up. Like, no. By no means should that be your takeaway from this presentation. This is good news, guys. The fact that there are so many already persuaded super environmentalists out there who are registered to vote, but not just walking out their door on election day, that's a huge opportunity. A huge opportunity. This is the low-hanging fruit of the climate movement. This is the low-hanging fruit. So please view this as good news. View this as good news. What can you do? Well, the first thing you can do, and Jerry mentioned this, on your own website, eldersclimateaction.org, and then you'll see that weird little thing at the, after it, elders_vote_climate_2018, but you'll find it on the website. You, your friends, your neighbors, your children, your grandchildren, anybody can go there and pledge to be a consistent climate voter. And when they do that, we at the Environmental Voter Project will remind them of every single election they have. Not just this big one coming up in November, but if they have a library trustee election next February, we're going to email them. And if they want text messages, we'll send them text messages too. We'll send them reminders of that election. And we'll do it using a lot of these peer pressure tools that we mentioned. We'll say things like, hey, George, you promised that you'd be a consistent voter. Tuesday's your opportunity to follow through on that promise. We know that this language will get them to vote. Well, it will dramatically increase their likelihood of voting. I won't promise that they actually will vote, but many, many more of them will. The second thing you can do is volunteer. We would obviously love to have you volunteer for the Environmental Voter Project, but I also know that Elders Climate Action has an enormous number of volunteer opportunities. And guys, we're never going to get these next 90 days back. Ever. I know I don't need to tell any of you how important the next 90 days are. And I would suggest to you that when you're watching election returns roll in on November 6th, you don't want to have any regrets. So please volunteer, whether it be for us, whether it be for Elders Climate Action, whether it be for someone else. This is a really important moment in time. And then finally, what I mentioned before, be loud and proud about being a voter. People need to understand that it is part of how you express yourself as a leader in your community and as someone who cares about climate change. Because in the environmental movement right now, we express ourselves in a lot of ways, a lot of difficult and impactful ways. We've changed how we eat. We've changed how we get around to work and to play. We have changed our purchasing habits. We've changed our electricity consumption habits. We spend hours each week recycling. We do a lot of hard things. But one thing that environmentalists don't do is vote. And so it's very, very important to remember that peer pressure works. Whether you're on Facebook or whether you're talking to your friends in the farmer's market or anything, make sure they know that you wouldn't be caught dead not voting this year. It is the highest form of environmental citizenship as far as you're concerned. And if you're loud and proud about that, you will change people's habits. You will. And finally, I'll finish by just saying this. When we get environmentalists to vote more often, and I use we in the largest possible sense, all of you, all of us, the entire environmental movement, not only will we be more likely to elect environmental candidates, but I suggest to you that politicians care so much about getting elected that simply by changing who votes, we will change the policy that's made. By which I mean, there's one thing you can depend on every politician to do, and that is try their damnedest to win. And so every politician is always going to poll likely voters to figure out how they can cobble together 51% of the vote. And the more of those voters who deeply care about climate change and the environment, well, we can change everything. Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives. I suggest to you that if we all wake up tomorrow morning and the front page of the Washington Post said that likely voters in the upcoming midterms listed climate change as their number 3 priority, well, the whole world would change overnight. Politicians would be falling over themselves to try to lead on climate change because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. Nothing. We've seen how our major political parties have shifted on big issues over the last 3 years just to get elected. Politicians go where the votes are. It's that simple. And we in the environmental movement have this silent green majority that isn't showing up on election day. And so we need to start doing that. So I've tried to stay brief and leave a lot of time for Q&A. That's where I will finish. Actually, I'm going to finish on this last slide so you can just see the 3 things that I mentioned. I realized that I just breezed over a lot of the stuff that we do, and I would welcome all of your questions so I can try to go into more detail on the things that you care most about. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathaniel. That was amazing, and I'm certain quite a mind blower to most people who would presume and assume, certainly as I did before I heard you speak and saw the data, that it just was natural that I would assume that environmentalists vote. So we do have some questions. Let me pull them up.
Great.
Climate change affects every other issue on this list. How do we open people's minds to this fact?
So that is a great question. And first of all, let me just agree with the premise that underlies the question. Yes, climate change is the existential issue. It impacts every other political issue that people could possibly care about. And now let me give a very honest answer to that question. I don't know. I don't know how to convince people that climate change does impact all of these other issues that people care about. And I'll be totally honest with you about that. That's why we at the Environmental Voter Project are essentially taking the easy way out. What we're saying is there are so many difficult communications problems that we have in the climate movement. It's so hard to get people who don't appreciate the importance of climate change to start appreciating it. And I freely admit, I don't have the silver bullet answer to that question. So instead, what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we say, okay, let's find the people who don't need to be convinced. Let's just find them, find the people who don't need to be convinced, yet aren't voting, and get them to vote. And so whoever asked that question, it's an outstanding question. I wish I had the answer. And I freely admit the Environmental Voter Project is taking the easy way out. We don't know how to convince people to care more about climate change or convince people to understand the connection between climate change and other issues. So instead, we find the ones who care but aren't voting and we turn them into better voters.
Thank you. So we've got some more questions. This is from Libby. Why do these registered environmentalist voters not vote? What is the cause, or what is the reason that they're not voting? They're registered and they don't go to the polls.
Great question, Libby. Outstanding question. I am going to give you a very nuanced and well-researched answer, but I can almost guarantee you that it's going to be kind of unsatisfying. And the reason is this: we don't know. We don't know why these environmentalists aren't voting. But I think you'll be interested in hearing why we don't know, because we've actually done a lot of research on this, and I think it's worthwhile for me to discuss this research. As any behavioral scientist will be able to tell you, it's really easy to set up an experiment that tells you how to get someone to take an action. So for instance, you set up an experiment that tells you if you give someone a $5 coupon, they'll buy a product, but if you give them a $2 coupon, they won't buy a product. That's an example of an experiment on how to get someone to take an action. What's really hard, though, is to set up an experiment that tells you why someone isn't taking an action, like voting. In fact, it's almost impossible to set up a really rigorous experiment. The only thing you can do is ask them. That's really the only thing you can do. And so we've done that. We polled hundreds, even thousands of environmentalists to try to figure out why they weren't voting. And we learned some amazing things. The first thing I'll tell you about is we did a poll where we polled, I think, about 500 or 600 environmentalists who are registered to vote and had been registered for at least 5 years, but had never voted once. And then we had another population of super environmentalists who never missed an election. They were super voters. And what we did was we asked each of these groups, the non-voters and the super voters, the same set of questions about the importance of civic engagement and voting and politics and politicians. And we found out two amazing things. The first thing we found out, Libby, was both groups answered every question exactly the same. So we asked the super voters, do you think it's important to vote in every election? And of course, they said, yeah, it's really important. We asked the non-voters the same question, and they said, oh yeah, it's really important to vote in every election. We asked the non-voters, do you think politicians care about the issues that you care about? And they said, no, they don't care. We asked the super voters the same question, and they said, no, politicians don't care about the issues I care about. We asked the non-voters if they think that all politicians were the same. And they said, yeah, all politicians are the same. The super voters said, yeah, all politicians are the same. The non-voters said, my vote doesn't make a difference. The super voters said, my vote doesn't make a difference. It was really amazing. So we found a lot of the excuses that non-voters gave for not voting, but we're not convinced that those are actual causes of them not voting, because people who vote give the same reasons. They give the same excuses. This is kind of a black box. It's very hard to understand why these people aren't voting. But let me finish by getting to the second important thing that we learned from this study. The one question that we asked that was unique to just the non-voters was we asked them an open-ended question, which is kind of expensive in polling. But Libby, you asked a very important question, and it's one that we ask ourselves a lot. We asked these non-voters, when you don't vote, what are your reasons for not voting? Now, obviously, people gave a whole bunch of different reasons, and we put them into categories, and we tried to tally them up. But the one thing that we noticed that was absolutely extraordinary was that 74% of the respondents said, no, I always vote. Now, I want to remind you all, who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. It's public information. These people were lying their pants off. And we thought they might lie, so we actually had a backup question ready to go. And we said, okay, on the rare occasion that you don't vote, what are your reasons for not voting? We wanted to give them the freedom to admit why they don't vote. The number reduced a little bit. It was a slightly smaller majority, but still a majority. Still 51% said, no, you don't get it. I always vote. They lied their pants off. And so to answer your question, Libby, we don't know why these environmentalists aren't voting. And we've done a lot of research on it, and other people have too. And we probably will never know. It's a black box. But what we do know is this. We know how to get them to vote, which is ultimately far more important. And one of our most powerful tools for getting them to vote can be revealed in that lie that I just spoke about. Overwhelming majorities of people who never vote lie their pants off to pollsters and swear up and down that they vote every time there's an election. And that is a perfect example of why social pressure and peer pressure work. Because even people who don't vote still buy into the societal norm that voting's important. They still want everybody to think that they vote all the time, which is why I said it's so important for all of you to be loud and proud about why voting is important to you.
Thank you, Nathaniel. That was just every explanation is just mind-blowing to what we inherently believe in our hearts. Here's another question, and that is, why did you pick the states that you did? Can you just give an example of one of the states and why you picked it?
That's a great question. So we launched in Massachusetts 2.5 years ago for two reasons. One, it's where I live. And two, there were going to be a lot of elections during our first year where we were trying to prove our concept. And obviously the only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to have an election. So we wanted a lot of opportunities to prove that what we were doing could work. Now, why did we expand into the other 5 states? Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. The number one reason was that each of those 5 states have enormous numbers of non-voting environmentalists. And that's really important to us as an organization, because in order for us to have a big impact, we need to have a lot of targets. We need to have a big denominator of non-voting environmentalists. If we went into a place like Idaho, we could kill it every time there was an election, and it still wouldn't make a difference because there just aren't that many non-voting environmentalists in Idaho. But in those 5 states, we found enormous populations of non-voting environmentalists. And if you go to our website, you can look at our 2017 annual report, and you can see a map there that shows about 21 or 22 states where we've identified really large populations of non-voting environmentalists. And those are the states where we think we can have the biggest impact.
Great, thank you. So we're assuming you'll be able to move beyond your 6 states, moving into the 2020 election. Okay, another question. Would it bring more environmentalists out to vote if we can get a candidate or candidates to really discuss their views on climate change?
So that's a great question. I am, by nature of the work that I do, I try to bring a lot of scientific rigor to all of the studies that we do. And so I'll give you a quick answer and then a more nuanced answer. My quick, honest answer is, I don't know and no one knows. It's really hard to test. By definition, you can't run 5,000 candidates at the same time and see how people react to it. But what do I think? Yeah, I absolutely think that it would drive turnout if we had candidates who spoke more about climate change. Absolutely, absolutely. However, and I think this is so important to understand, it's not necessary Would it be helpful? Yeah. But it is not necessary. We can dramatically increase the number of environmentalists who vote regardless of who runs. And I'm going to use an example to illustrate this. I know that there are people on this webinar from around the country, but I'll use myself as an example. I live in Massachusetts. In 2016, let me tell you what was on our ballot. Everybody knew that Hillary Clinton was going to get all of our electoral college votes. Everybody knew who was going to win each of our 9 congressional seats because no one was challenged. We have 50 state Senate seats and 150 state rep seats. Only 4 of those 200 races were close. And we had 4 statewide ballot initiatives, the closest of which was decided by 21%, 21 points. So there is nothing on our ballot that I could claim my vote would impact, or that anybody in their right mind would think their vote would impact. Yet 4 million people walked out their door on election day to vote. 4 million. And unless they were insane or living in a cave, not a single one of them were voting because they thought that their vote would have an impact on the outcome of that election. You would be crazy in Massachusetts if you thought your vote was going to have an impact. No, if we're honest with ourselves, the reason we were probably all voting wasn't because there was some transactional value in it, but rather because of who we are and who we want to be. We had probably decided at some point in our lives that it was important to be civically engaged, that it was important to be a voter. Or maybe we didn't want to admit to our spouse that we didn't vote. Or maybe we talked to all of our friends about politics all the time, and so it was important to vote. The act of voting was almost expressing an aspect of our personality. And I bring that up because it's not only very clear behavioral science behind a lot of these turnout messages that we use, but it also gets back to this question about, don't we need to have a climate candidate, or won't a climate candidate help turn people out? Yes, climate candidates will help drive turnout, but understand that most people walk out their door on election day not because they think their vote is going to elect candidate A or candidate B. They walk out the door on election day because of some societal pressure or some aspect of their personality that's made them decide, I'm going to take part in this. I am going to be a voter. And I think that's so important to understand. We can't wait for a savior. We can't wait for a Messiah. And we also can't think that we need that in order to change this environmental turnout problem, because we don't. We don't.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more quick question. And this is somebody who's saying, well, what about the states that you aren't working in? Is there something we can do in those states?
Absolutely. And that's a great, great question. So the first thing you can do is sign the Elders Climate Action Voter Pledge. Because even if you're not in one of those 6 states where the Environmental Voter Project is working, if you sign that pledge, or if you get your friends to sign that pledge, or your children or your grandchildren, the Environmental Voter Project will send those people reminders prior to every election. Whether they are in one of our 6 states or not, we have a database of every single election, from library trustee and dog catcher elections up to president, in all 50 states plus the territories. And whenever anybody who signs that pledge has an election, we will do our damnedest to make sure that they get to the polls. So that's one thing that you can do. If you live in Montana and you want to get as many environmentalists as possible to vote, spread the word about this Elders Climate Action Voter Pledge, because if they sign that pledge, they'll be folded into EVP's turnout universe, and we will mobilize them, whether they're in one of our 6 states or not. The second thing that you can do is, even if you're not in one of our 6 states, if you want to mobilize people in those 6 states, go to our website and sign up to volunteer. We're already working with a lot of your members. We will train you over webinar. It's a very, very easy training process. And you'll be able to call or text voters from the comfort of your own home. You can sit there watching television and text these non-voting environmentalists we've identified in Florida and Nevada and Pennsylvania and some really, really important states. Now, obviously, you can only do that into the 6 states where we're active, but you can do that from wherever you live. We've got 300 volunteers in California who are texting people in Florida and Georgia for us. So those are 2 ways that you can really, really get involved using our tools. Get people to sign that pledge and also volunteer to turn out voters in these 6 states. And because I know that this is the last question, I just want to finish by saying, guys, please, I mentioned this in my presentation, think about yourself 3 months from now. Think about your future self watching election returns roll in. Don't have any regrets. Don't have any regrets. Volunteer, get people to sign this voter pledge. This is an existentially important moment in time for people who care about climate change. And we need to get involved. We need to. I hope that we'll be able to be involved together. The Environmental Voter Project loves working with all of you. Elders Climate Action is absolutely amazing. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity this evening, but also just the opportunity all throughout this year to be working with all of you. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. And I think we have our marching orders. We, can talk with our neighbors, our friends. And I can tell you from my perspective, my friends, all that are environmentalists, certainly all claim to vote. And now I wonder, do they really? And I think that's important for us to recognize and to really understand. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We too love working with you. I'm certain all our attendees had a wonderful evening. And we're going to now take a short break. We'll come back at 7:03. We'll come back at 7:08. Very quick break so you can stretch your legs, get a cup of tea, a glass of wine. And we'll come back and have another project that we're working on, and that is the candidates climate pledge, asking candidates to pledge they're going to take climate action to get that conversation going. And you'll hear from 2 of our ECA people to do that part of the webinar. So thank you so much again. It's been wonderful. And we really, 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 really appreciate your time and your information. Just incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. Just as a reminder, this slide shows you where you can go to Elders Vote for the Climate, and go to our website and you can sign the voter pledge that Nathaniel was talking about. That's in partnership with the Environmental Voter Project that Nathaniel is a part of. And so all of that information will then be aggregated within the Environmental Voter Project information. So now we'll move on to the second part of our webinar, and you're going to hear from ECA leaders who are going to give you all of the information that you need to participate in the Candidates Pledge Climate Action Project, which is another avenue where we hope to impact the upcoming election and impact the candidates in what their positions are, and get climate on the table and as part of the discussion moving forward into this election. This midterm election is, as Nathaniel said, is incredibly important. It is the most important one we've had for quite some time. So I'm going to introduce to you 2 people, Margo Frank, who is co-chair of ECA's Communications Committee and is a member of our Coordinating Council. She loves being a grandmother, but worries about the world her grandkids will inherit. In addition to her work at ECA, she's a part-time clinical social worker, creating resiliency in her rural Northern California community where wildfires are an ongoing threat. And Margo is here with us tonight and is sitting in her home between two fires, the two major fires in California. So thank you, Margo, for doing this. And then the second part of this will be Jen Chandler, who is the Director of Operations at ECA. And for the past 3 years, Jen has been working to help us build a movement of elders committed to climate action. She's got a background in nonprofit management, visual arts, and education. And without her, we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are today. So moving on, I'd like to introduce Margo to you, and she's going to talk about our Candidates Pledge Climate Action Project. Margo, it's yours.
Thank you, Jerry. Jen, if you can bring up the slide with our goals on it. I want to talk a little bit about why we're doing this Candidates Pledge Climate Action Project. As Nathaniel mentioned, you know, candidates and elected officials are not going to talk about climate change if they don't think that it matters to people who are likely to vote. So every time we speak up, and when we speak up and we ask them for their commitment, we're letting them know that we care and that we care as elders. And I think we discovered when we visited candidate or congressional offices in DC last year that it's unusual for people in DC to be approached and asked for something that's not of benefit to the person who's asking. And that we stand out when we speak up because we are speaking up for our grandchildren, for future generations, not about ourselves. Also, elders are more likely to vote than other demographic groups. And so our voice carries some weight with people running for office. Our first goal, of course, is that we want to get a commitment from all candidates running for office that they will take action on climate change if they are elected. This means that we're going to ask all the candidates for any particular office. I'm going to talk a little more about our nonpartisan approach, but similar to what Nathaniel said, their organization's approaches, we do not endorse candidates, but we want to make sure that we put the same effort into getting a pledge from every candidate running for any particular office. Our second goal is to really make sure that climate change becomes part of the conversation this election year. As Nathaniel mentioned, unless candidates hear that it matters to people who are going to vote for them, they're not going to address it. And our pledge is unique, you'll see when I go over that in a couple of minutes, in that it's different than other pledges that oftentimes candidates and elected officials are asked to sign that are usually specific to a particular piece of legislation or action. Ours is much broader, and really we are asking them to take a stand, as it says in our third goal here, to take a stand on climate change. Do they believe that climate change is real? Are they willing to say that they understand the impacts of it and that they want to take action on it? And of course, doing this action of engaging them in signing the pledge is just the beginning of building a relationship with them so that once they are elected, we can be monitoring whether they're holding to their pledge. As Nathaniel pointed out, when somebody pledges something, then you can hold their feet to the fire over that. And then our fourth goal is to make sure that they understand that the will and power of elders to take a stand on climate action is that we are speaking up, and that their stand on climate action will determine how we vote and where we donate money for election campaigns. I think we're ready for the next slide, Jen. Elders Climate Action is a project of the Conscious Elders Network, which is a nonprofit organization that's designated by the IRS. And this means that we must be nonpartisan. We are dedicated to providing information and opportunities for our members to get engaged and take action on climate change, but we do not endorse any candidates for office. And as you engage in this project, we want to make sure that you will not speak up and say, oh, Elders Climate Action is endorsing this candidate because he signed the pledge. We cannot do that, but we can let people know that that candidate signed the pledge. And I'll show you how we're going to do that. So basically, we just give them the opportunity to share their commitment to active climate change legislation by signing the pledge. And as I mentioned, we're going to ask candidates from all parties to sign this pledge. And while we specifically are targeting people running for Congress and the Senate on the national level, we can also use it to approach people running on the state level or on the local level. So let's look at the pledge, Jen, and I'm going to read over it. I want you to notice as I read it that we talk about the economic impact, our role as a world leader, and national security. We focus it on things, on issues that matter to all of these elected officials. So it says, I recognize that climate change poses a threat to the health of our citizens, our economic growth, our reputation as a world leader, and our national security. I will engage with my fellow elected officials at local, state, and federal level to support climate legislation and regulatory policies to avoid the potentially devastating social, economic, and national security impact of climate change. I recognize that such legislation can support economic growth by stimulating technological innovation, development of a more resilient infrastructure, and increasing domestic employment. For those of you who were on the last webinar and heard Bob Inglis from Republic EN talk about important ways of communicating with conservative candidates about climate change, I want to encourage you to, if you already were part of that webinar or not, to go back to our website and listen to it again and take some notes, because it will help you in being able to talk about this issue with candidates who may be coming from a more conservative viewpoint. And I just want to say that, as Jerry mentioned, I'm living within 10 miles of the two fires that started the Mendocino Complex fire in Northern California, the biggest fire in history in the state of California. And there are climate disasters and devastation happening all over the planet this summer. So it is much more on people's minds, and I think it's a launching point for all of us in bringing this up with candidates. So let's look at how do you find the candidates pledge on our website. Well, we made it easy for you. There's a couple of different ways you can do it. So when you go to eldersclimateaction.org, at the top of the page, you see the Get Inspired, Get Informed, Get Engaged tags. And if you put your cursor over the Get Engaged one, you get a drop-down menu. And then in the Take Action with ECA section, on the side of that, then you can bring up Candidates Pledge Climate Action 2018. So that's one way to find us. The other way is to just scroll down the homepage until you come to the section that says Take Action with ECA. The first action shown on the left of that box is the Elders Vote for the Climate, our collaboration with the Environmental Voter Project. And the middle one is the Candidates Pledge Climate Action section. And so you can click there, and that will also take you to the pledge project and information on that. Now, let's look at the next slide, Jen. Many of you, like me, maybe have never approached a candidate about anything, may never have spoken up at a town hall meeting. Some of you probably are old hands at this, but up until a couple of years ago, I had never done that, and I was pretty nervous about it. We want to give you support and guidance and help you to feel as confident as possible. You do not have to be a climate scientist or a policy wonk to be able to do this project. All you have to be is a concerned voter. So, you know, this may be something new for you. Certainly as we get older, as we are elders now, we know that the more that you do something that's unfamiliar, the easier it gets. So you might think of doing this project just as a way to practice getting more engaged with elected officials. When you're on the Candidates Pledge Climate Action page, under the, and you scroll down to the Need Help section, you will see 3 boxes there. Now on our website, there won't be that big green arrow that says need help, but you'll see it very clearly when you get to that section. And the first section on the left is our Getting Started guide. And in there are just some simple tips to help you get started. One of the most important things that we can do this, to engage in this project, is not to try to do it all alone. If, like me, you live in a large district or you live in a more rural area, it's really helpful to have other people to partner with you. But wherever you are, even if you don't know other members of ECA, you can ask neighbors, friends, people at your faith community, other groups you belong to, your book club, whatever. Ask other people if they would like to help you do this so that you're not having to undertake it all on your own, and you can support one another. And it's actually doing that is a great way to get a local Elders Climate Action group started. So it may be that you, by reaching out and pulling some people in to help you on this project, you're able to build a chapter where you live. That's really how the Northern California chapter got started after the 2016 election, when we undertook a pledge campaign at that time also. Also, if you have moved and you used to live in a different district or state, we encourage you to reach out to the candidates in that area, or to ask people that you know in that area to join our campaign also. We really want to try to get as many candidates as possible talking about climate change, thinking about climate change, and pledging action on climate change. Now, you might be thinking, I don't even know who's running for office in my district. I missed the results of the primary. I can't remember, too many things to keep track of. Well, on that Getting Started guide section, we have a link to Ballotpedia. And if you want to bring up the next slide, thanks, Jen. Ballotpedia.org is an amazing organization. You go to their website and you just put in, I think it's all you put in is your zip code, and it will tell you who is running for office in your district and your state. And it will give you links to their campaign websites. One thing that's really important to remember is that federal law prohibits any elected official from using their congressional office and staff on their campaign. That means that if you contact their office in Washington and ask them to sign the pledge that way because they're running up for office again, they will not be able to respond to you. So by going to Ballotpedia, you can find out how to contact their campaign office, where it's located, their email address, their phone number, and you can begin to build a relationship with some staff people there. So I really want to encourage you to use that as a resource. Also, we have, next to the Getting Started guide, there is the Talking Points for Climate Pledge Meetings section. And in here, we have some data about health and economic impacts of climate change, information about our role as a world leader in national security and the impact of climate change in those areas, how addressing climate change can lead to innovation and a more resilient nation. And there's even some quotes that you might draw on from members of the bipartisan Congressional Climate Solutions Caucus, which is a growing group in Washington that is part of the Congress there. And then the final section in the Need Help section is our Talking Climate with Others section. So if you're there's some tips in there for how to bring up climate change in an individual meeting with a candidate or at a public event like a candidates forum or a town hall meeting. We want to remind you that candidates are just people like you and me. Many of them are parents and grandparents. They clearly care about the future and what's happening for future generations. Now, the way they want to address that may be different than your way of thinking, but they do care. And if you can connect with their caring, we've got a better chance of developing a dialogue and a possibility of getting them to address climate change. So the first step is always, of course, to build a relationship. Speaking from your heart is the most powerful way. When you speak about why you're doing this, why you care, it really carries a powerful message. And as I mentioned earlier, we really experienced that when we were in Washington visiting every congressional and Senate office last year. In this section, you'll also find a sample script for meeting with them, some tips for writing letters to your representatives, some links to information about the impact of climate change where you live. This is incredibly valuable information in being able to talk about it on a local and state level with candidates and asking them how are they going to address this when it's impacting so many people in their district. There also are some responses developed by our friends at Citizens Climate Lobby to talk about concerns they may have about carbon fee and dividend. And if you don't know much about carbon fee and dividend, go to the Citizens Climate Lobby website. There's a wealth of information about it there. In our next webinar, we'll also be going over all the resources that are on our website. We have suggestions for books and videos and films. We've got videos that we've created. We've got links to other websites, all kinds of information. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to explain to you how to get that signed pledge and to get that information to us.
Yes, thank you, Margo. And I'm really excited to be here. And I just want to remind people that you can submit any questions you might have in the question and answer section on this Zoom call. So if there's any questions that come up about using the pledge as we go through these slides, feel free to submit a question and I will try to answer it later. We've tried to make it as easy as possible for you to be able to go and solicit the signatures on the pledge from your candidates. And so there's two different ways that you can get this pledge in the hands of the candidates in your area. The first way is going to be for them to directly sign the pledge from the ECA website. So here on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see this is a screenshot of the Climate Pledge the Candidates Pledge Climate Action Project page. And you'll see if you scroll down that page just a little bit, that down here, the first sort of big green text, you can see my green arrow pointing there, is where the candidate can go to sign the pledge themselves. So one option is, you're in a candidate meeting, you can invite the candidate to bring up the website, you could send them the link after the website, and we've also created an email template that I'll be showing you in just a moment to send out to those candidates. That would be asking them to sign the pledge. I know in Arizona that the pilot project happening in Arizona, that they have utilized this method and have sent out some sort of bulk emails to the candidates in Arizona and asking them to sign the pledge. And there's been a number of people that have come to our website and signed the pledge themselves. And that's what we want to see. We want to see lots of candidates taking action on climate change and stepping up to the plate to sign this pledge. So when they go to that particular link, if they were to click on that link, this is what they would see. They would see the pledge in the top. They would have a place for their name, their district, if it's applicable, state, the office that they're running for, their party affiliation, and then contact information for their campaign. We also ask if we have permission to use a headshot of them or to acknowledge them on social media. and then we ask them to verify their pledge. So we want them to check the box that they say yes and submit this pledge. That way we know that the candidate themselves completed this pledge by checking that box and submitting it. Another, oh, and let me tell you this too. If you're looking to figure out how to send just a link directly to the pledge, you can always select the URL at the top of the page and cut and paste this URL directly into an email. So this URL would give them a direct link right into the candidate pledge form. It would bypass the ECA website. We've also created an email template. So just below where we were before, signing the candidate's pledge, the next green text below that, where my green arrow is pointing right now, says send an email to a candidate in your area. It's the candidate email template. And I have produced a short 2-minute video just to show you how to drop the information from this document into your email. So I'm going to show you that and talk you through that process in case cutting and pasting into an email is new for you. So here's what you would see when you click that link, when you click that purple button on that last page. You would come to something that looks like this, and there's directions at the top there. And again, a reminder that you can get your candidate email addresses on Ballotpedia. But essentially what you're going to do is you are going to you're going to select the text, and then you're going to use copy, which is Command-C or Control-C if you're on a PC. And you will copy that text, and then you'll go into your email and compose an email, and you're going to drop that text right into the email by hitting Control-P or Command-P, which is paste. Once you've pasted into the document, you will want to go ahead and change your contact information. So here you can see I'm adding my name, my address, and I will add my email. We encourage you to use your address. If you don't want to include your address, then put your city and state. This way they know that you're a constituent. An address often will, they will contact you back if you provide an address. So if you send a letter to most candidates or most elected officials, it's likely you'll get a address back or a letter back if you include your address. You can also see that you can change the text, so you can write dear whoever. You can also include your own personal text in the body of the email if you want to write something specific to your state. Make sure you include a subject line that captures the attention of your candidate, and then insert their email address at the top. Now, if you wanted to do a blind carbon copy is a way that you can send multiple emails, the same email to multiple email addresses. So by blind carbon copying them, they won't see who you've sent the email to other than themselves, and they won't see the email addresses. So if you're going to email out to a large group of candidates, say you want to email all of the people running for state senate, all parties, you would use a blind carbon copy, and then down in the greeting line, you would change that to Dear Candidate for State Senate, or something that's a little bit more general and broad. So you can really personalize these emails, or you could send something that is a blind carbon copy out to all of the candidates if you wanted to try to just tackle this project all in one big email. Whatever works best for you, we're just trying to make it as user-friendly and as simple of a process as possible. The other way that you can access the pledge is by printing it out, by downloading and printing. So here you can see that there's two separate pledges. One, Candidates Pledge Climate Action 2018 is for federal. So that would be House and Senate federal offices. And then we have state and local. And state and local could be, it could be county commissioner, it could be state's attorney, it could be whatever, any elected position that you have in your state, you can send this pledge to those individuals. And just below the image of the pledge, you will see a purple text, and that purple text is the download link. So if you click here, you're going to get to a file that you're going to be able to download, and then you can print that out on your home printer. It has room on the form to put your name and your email address, and that way they know what constituent has contacted them. And you can take that directly to a meeting with a representative, or you could take that to a town hall meeting or a community forum or something of the like, and ask the candidate in person. In Arizona, I know that the Arizona chapter has attended a number of these types of meetings, and what they tend to do is they pose a question to the candidate, and so that there's already a little bit of a relationship formed with the candidate, and when the forum is over or the community event is over, they'll go up and ask that candidate to sign our pledge. And it has been very successful in Arizona, which tends to be a very conservative community. Once you've received that signed pledge, you could upload it here on our website, or the candidate themselves could come here and upload that signed pledge. Again, 2 different buttons based on if it's a federal pledge or a state and local pledge. But if you click the purple button down here on the bottom, you will get to a form that looks like this. On the right, you see your name and email. That is whoever is submitting the form would fill that in. They would fill in the candidate name, running for the office of, state and congressional district if applicable, and then upload a copy or a scanned version or a photograph of that signed pledge. The upload process is very easy, even if you're not very computer savvy, but you do need to either to take a photograph on your cell phone or scan that document into your computer. If you don't have the ability to do that, just contact me at info@eldersclimateaction.org, and I'd be more than happy to work with you to figure out the best way that we can get your signed pledges uploaded to our website. And here in the center, you can see when you click add file, you're going to see a window that looks like this, and you're just going to click that select files from your computer box, and then you'll be able to go in and retrieve the file from your computer and upload it. It's a very easy process, but I know some of us get a little confused and aren't very computer savvy. So again, if you're worried about uploading, contact me at info@eldersclimateaction.org, and I'd be more than happy to walk you through the process. To see the candidates who have signed the pledge, again, it is the box down here at the bottom under the email template, and it says pledge responses. And I believe, Margo, you were going to take over from this point.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. And I noticed there was one question from Melissa asking how to avoid duplication. So this is perfect timing now to answer that question. And I want to remind everybody, this has been a lot of information and detail for you to remember, and that all of this is being recorded, and you'll be able to go back to our website and listen to it again and again if you need to. And of course, you can always reach out to us at info@eldersclimateaction.org for help in sorting this out. So when you go to the pledge responses, like this that Jen has up on the screen now, brings up a spreadsheet of candidates who have signed the pledge. Now they are listed by state, and the states are listed in alphabetical order. Within each state, there is not any distinct order for how the candidates are listed. So you would scroll through the ones that for your state to see if you can find a pledge already having been signed and submitted from the candidates that you would be approaching. You'll notice here that there are lots of names from Arizona. That's because earlier this year, our Arizona chapter did the piloting of this project and managed to get responses from lots and lots of people running for state and federal office in Arizona. So before you're going to go out and approach a candidate, you might go to this page and look and see if any of the candidates in your district or senatorial candidates have already signed. If you approach a candidate and they say, oh, we already signed that, you can look on this website and say, well, we don't seem to have received it yet. Now, it's true that a couple of years ago, we had a different climate pledge that we did approach candidates with. We had a much smaller project. We did not have very many people signing it in very many states, but it may be that a candidate that you approached did sign it in the 2016 election. However, you can say to them, this year we are doing a new pledge. It's a stronger statement, and we're going to be listing your name on our website, showing that you have signed it, so that people will be able to see that you spoke up and you took a stand on climate change, and encourage them to do it again. Now, once you get a signed pledge from someone, it's really important that we thank them. So if we can have the next slide, Jen. Great, thank you. This is an essential part of building your relationship with a candidate who may become your elected official. So for those of you who use social media, you can use this piece on purple box on the left. You can right-click on it and download it and post it on social media. If you do that, make sure that you tag the candidate or include their name, state, district, and tag Elders Climate Action with the @ symbol Elders Climate Action. So that's one thing that you can do. You also could cut and paste this text box that's outlined here in green and paste that onto social media. So of course, you want to edit it and fill in your candidate's information in the state and district. You could also personalize it if you wanted to, and you can post that on social media. And then below that is a box that you can cut and paste for emailing, for thanking a candidate. And again, you want to cut and paste that into an email and fill in the correct information about the candidate. And in this, if you're doing this by email, I really encourage you, if you're comfortable, in personalizing it in some way about what this means to you that the candidate has done this, what this means for the future for the children that you know and love, and thank them for it, and let them know that you will be following their campaign, and if elected, how they, what stands and actions they take once they're elected, and that you will be continuing to contact them to make sure that they follow up on this pledge. One of the things you also might do is, if you get both candidates for a particular office signing the pledge, you could write a letter to the editor saying that both of them had. Or if neither of them signed, you could write a letter to the editor saying neither of them signed. Because we don't endorse a particular candidate, I would discourage you from writing a letter to the editor saying, you know, Sally Smith signed, but John Smith did not. So that it doesn't look like we are endorsing one or the other of those candidates. And I think now, Jerry, if you want to tell them about how they can engage more with us about this, that would be great.
So we have not had a lot of opportunity to have interactive talk on this, on our webinars. We will have a few minutes for questions and answers very shortly. And I'd like to thank Margo and Jen for this great presentation and just reinforce how important it is. You know, you heard from Nathaniel, this is a really important election. You're hearing from all of us. I think we all know how important it is. And the more strategies we have to get candidates on board, to get people to vote, the better we will be in the long run. And the better our grandchildren will be. And that's, you know, clearly one of my strong interests. So next Monday at 6 o'clock Eastern time, 3 o'clock Pacific time, we're going to have another Climate Tea and Talk, which will be an open forum to just talk about and discuss either these issues that have been raised in this webinar or other climate change issues that you may wish to talk about. It will be a small, much more intimate group where we'll be able to have a lot more conversation. So that is on Monday, August 13th at 6 o'clock. And then our final webinar is going to be on August 22nd. And we are incredibly, incredibly fortunate to have Catherine Neho, who's going to join us and talk about climate change and how to bring it to the local level in this very politically charged environment. She is a world-renowned, internationally renowned climate scientist, if you haven't heard of her. And we're really very fortunate that she's going to be able to speak to us. And the second part of that webinar is going to include all of the tools that ECA has developed that are going to be available to you so that you don't have to recreate the wheel. If you need a template for a letter, or if you know, whatever you're going to need to be able to take action locally, you will be able to, have. So now I'd like to thank Margo and Jen and open it up to some questions. And the first question is, I guess to anybody, is from this individual, I don't know anybody and I've never been to a town hall meeting. What would you suggest I do to get started on this? Maybe Margo, you could address that a little. You're muted.
Whoops. No, I think I'm unmuted now. Hi. Okay. I'm thinking about the first time I went to a town hall meeting, and it was not about climate change. It was about something else. This was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Maybe it's the only time I've been to a town hall meeting, actually. And, you know, I'm somebody who's pretty comfortable speaking up, but I know that having someone else with you is really helpful. So, you know, you might, sometimes at these town hall meetings, actually, instead of asking the question, or candidate debates, they ask you to write the question on a card that gets passed up to the front, and a moderator asks the question, so it's not so public for you. You might want to write it down for yourself ahead of time and bring it with you so that you just read what your question is. You just ask the question and you sit back down. You're not so much in the public view. Or you might ask somebody else to come with you. Maybe that person is more comfortable standing up and asking a question than you are. Or having that person with you helps you to feel more courageous in doing this. And I tell you, the more you do it, the easier it will get. The first time I walked into that congressional office, even with a group of people, I was shaking in my shoes. But the more I did it, the easier it got.
Thank you, Margo. And we have a comment from somebody in the audience, and that is related to the question of how do I know whether they've already been asked by other ECA members to sign a pledge. And it actually happened that somebody went to a town hall meeting, asked the candidate to sign the pledge, and the candidate said, "Oh, I've already signed that pledge." And so what the individual said was, you certainly did. And that was in a previous pledge cycle. And we now have a new pledge that we really would appreciate your signing. It's different than the last one, and we're separating it out from the previous one. That one was a previous pledge from a couple of years ago, and kind of left it at that. So that was a way to address it, where a candidate may think they've signed a pledge, and truly candidates get a lot of pledge requests in the mail and in the email. So acknowledging that, rather than saying, no, you didn't, acknowledging that they may have signed it, but this one is a new one. We just put it out, and we would love for them to be able to sign this one also.
And may I add something to that, Jerry? Yeah, I would also suggest that, you know, if somebody says, well, I just signed one a couple months ago, you say, and you might say, because if you're at a debate or a town hall meeting, you're not looking up on the website to see if they've signed, you can say, I hope that that is true, that that was our pledge that you signed. I'm going to look up on our website when I get home and check and see. And if it turns out it wasn't our pledge, who might I contact to follow up with you to get a signature? And if they say, oh, somebody else already asked me about that, say, yeah, there's a lot of us who are concerned about it.
And
Right.
I think, and I would back that up with, it doesn't hurt to ask multiple times. It doesn't hurt for that ask to come from multiple people. Maybe someone's a little on the fence about signing it. Maybe they don't typically sign pledges, but if they're asked by 12 of their constituents, perhaps at that point, they're gonna say, you know, I need to sign this pledge. My constituents are asking me to do this. The other thing that I'd like to add is that for some of us, the in-person ask is a barrier. And we understand that. You know, it's not comfortable for everybody to walk up to somebody and say, ask them to do something, right? To ask them to sign this pledge. So that's why we created the email template and the online pledge signing ability. And that is that you can send an email from the comfort of your own home, in your own little comfort zone, and you don't have to worry about that fear that you might have. I also would encourage you to break through that fear, step out of your comfort zone, and challenge yourself to make the ask in person, because I think a personal ask does carry more weight. They see you in person, they feel that social pressure. But if that's going to be a barrier to your participation, please use the email option, because we need as many of our members asking their candidates running for office to sign this pledge. So, and it's best if that email comes from someone in their district or someone in their state, someone that's indicated as a constituent.
Yeah, I would also add that I know in the last time that we did this, sometimes it took multiple contacts to get follow through. And one of the things you might do is call the campaign office and ask there, who would be the best person for me to talk to about getting the candidate to sign this pledge? And then you've got a personal contact with someone for follow-up.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we're just about out of time. I would like to thank Margo and Jen for that presentation. That was wonderful. I'd like to thank all our attendees for listening. I hope you'll join us for the Climate Tea and Talk on Monday, and then again next on the 22nd for Catherine Hayhoe. And I would like to just sign off now. Have a good evening, and thank you all.